Welcome, everybody, to this important conversation. Um, really excited to join all of you live on demand and across the globe and across this country. My name is Mike Rocha. I'm a co-founder of Revolve Impact. We're a social change agency based out of Los Angeles and work across the country centering issues of equity and justice. In the middle of an economic and health crisis that's unprecedented, now more than ever, we need a budget centered on humanity and diversity from policing and criminalization. I'm super honored to be a part of this conversation today, a much needed conversation. We're here to discuss Mayor Eric Garcetti's proposed $10.5 billion budget for LA that reduces services, furloughs city workers, and cuts the budget of all city departments except for the Los Angeles Police Department. In fact, at a time when crime in LA is at historic lows, the proposed budget significantly increases LAPD's budget, allocating approximately $3.15 billion, which is well over half of the city's total budget. Today, we plan to discuss with leading organizers and intellectuals what a budget that reflects the needs of the community looks like. This includes services for unhoused Angelenos, including housing in the thousands of empty hotel rooms throughout our city, more mental health services, rent suspension and forgiveness for the 55% of Angelenos who are currently unemployed, so they don't have to go back to work in unsafe and potentially deadly environments, more funding for education, and a lot more. We have some amazing speakers with us today. We're going to spend roughly around 35 minutes hearing from each of them on the LA budget and what we need from a budget, which is really a document that prioritizes what matters most to us during this pandemic. We'll then take some questions from viewers and close with actions that you can immediately take to make sure that the LA City Council spends our money on people and not police. For our Zoom viewers out there, if you'd like to ask a question, please submit in the question and answer box at the bottom of the screen. And I'd also like to direct your attention to the website for the People's Budget, peoplesbudgetla.com, where you can go to learn more about the issue and find next steps. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our incredible lineup of speakers that we have today. One, Dr. Melina Abdullah from Black Lives Matter Los Angeles. Thank you, Melina, for all that you do and for being a part of this conversation. Dr. Julianne Malveaux, an economist and former president of Bennett College, and the one and only Pastor Q from Church Without Walls. Thank you all for being a part of this, and we'll just jump in because I know we don't have that much time. First question that I just really want to ask is, we know that more spending on policing and criminalization means less spending on human-centered services. Who's going to be most hurt by the current budget proposal, in your opinion? And what are things that we should be doing differently?
So thank you, Mike. Thank you so much for hosting. And we want to just lift up that People's Budget LA just formed a week ago. And we planned this, this town hall only, I don't know, a couple days ago. And so we're grateful to you and Pastor Q and Dr. Malveaux for all spending your hour with us. We also want to lift up that today is the birthday of the Honorable Minister Malcolm X. And so we pray that the work that we do honors his spirit, that his commitment to justice and freedom and his willingness to constantly engage and evolve and do the work that needs to be done. We pray that it inhabits our work and our words here today. When you ask who's most likely to be harmed by this budget, we want to say that by overspending on police, you are cutting, the mayor is cutting every other department, right? So every other department is facing a 10% cut to its bottom line. We're talking about at a time when houselessness is soaring, and I'm sure Pastor Q will weigh in on this. He's cutting the spending for housing. We want to lift up that when you talk about crime, or so-called crime, we know that the best way to address it is by prevention and intervention work. And he has cut the budget to GRID, which is our youth development and our interventionist workers. And so it's everyone else other than police who will be harmed. We also know that more spending on police leads to more brutality and harassment and police killings. And so we're demanding that this process be slowed down so that we can engage fully, the people can engage fully, but also so that we prioritize the things that actually make communities safe. And so always at the bottom, always who gets the brunt of the brutality is Black people, of course, poor people, houseless folks, brown folks, all people of color, but Black folks absolutely get the brunt. And we can see this playing out already with what we see as an increased police state under this pandemic.
Pastor Q or Dr. Malveaux, anything you'd like to add to that?
Well, yes, Pastor Q, I think Melina eloquently laid it out for us, but I'd kind of like to bring in a little spirituality, and it reminds me of a passage in Proverbs where the individual says to God, you know, God, don't give me too much resources to where I'm going to get all arrogant and forget about you. But the individual also says, don't give me too little where I'm going to have to go steal and rob and dishonor your name. So a budget is a moral document. And so when mayors don't do what is right so that people can have enough so that they don't have to go steal and dishonor their God's name, then they are actually moving against that God, right? Whatever God you believe in. And so we know that historically, communities such as Skid Row has been underfunded, right? So we're not talking about, and the LAPD has been overly funded throughout historically. Just one example, $100 million was allocated towards homelessness in Skid Row, $100 million for a number of years, and 85% of that went to law enforcement. So anywhere you have a budget for houselessness or for anything, LAPD seems to be able to find their way into that budget, because we see, as a society, we see policing as the primary driver for public safety, and it is not so.
Thank you, Pastor Q. Dr. Malveaux, thank you for joining us. Anything you would like to add? I think you were on mute. Well, as we're figuring that out, let me jump back.
Starving the opportunity of basically helping people. We know that this pandemic has done so many things to so many people. We know that, 50% of those who are dying are Black and brown. We know that we're on the front lines. We're the people who basically stock the grocery shelves. We're the people, the CNAs, the certified nursing assistants who help the hospitals. We're the people who are doing the work. We're driving the buses, we're doing all of that, but they're being starved so that we can have more money for policing. If anything, what we've seen
Dr. Malveaux, can you hear us? I'm gonna pivot, if that's okay with folks. And Governor Newsom recently pointed out, stated that California is in a, quote, pandemic-induced recession. That's going to require bold steps and actions, both interventions in the short and long term. Here in Los Angeles right now, over half of LA workers are unemployed due to COVID-19. Economists have estimated that 42% of pandemic-related layoffs will be permanent. Like Dr. Malveaux stated, the brunt of this is Black and brown and poor folks in this city. Question to all the speakers is, how should the COVID-19 crisis play into the city's budgets, and specifically the budget decisions? How should this pandemic, like, how should this be driving these conversations that we're having on this budget right now?
You know,
Right.
I think that we need to look at this pandemic as an opportunity to look at all the inequalities that exist in our society. The people who have been celebrated have been the elite. The people who have not been celebrated have been the people at the bottom. The people who are making $15 an hour, the people who are getting on the bus and going to their jobs. And so I think this is an opportunity for us to look at the ways that we can recalibrate equality in our society. I think that it's an opportunity for workers and for those who are aligned with workers to lift their voices and to be heard. I think it's really important. As you know, some people are standing outside the state capitol saying we want to go back to work. Well, y'all going back to $40 an hour jobs. The people who have $15 an hour jobs don't have time to go outside and go back to work. So I think that this is an opportunity to take a microscopic look at the inequalities that exist in our society.
Dr. Abdullah?
Sure. And I think that frame is really, really important. And I think it's also important that we unpack these numbers. So oftentimes we use this umbrella term and we say things like people of color, which is hugely important because we all do share, especially Black, brown, and indigenous people, a disproportionate, there's a disproportionate impact on our communities. I also want to lift up that there are particular impacts for Black people. And so all across the country, when we look at the COVID-related deaths, Black people are overrepresented, representing 2 to 3 times our population share in most cities. But then the national numbers just came out that said almost 60% of the COVID-19 deaths are of Black people. We also know that when we talk about the police state that's been rolled out and that's fueled under the guise of, you know, community safety in a pandemic, that's also disproportionately hitting Black people. In New York City, there have been 40 arrests based on supposed social distancing violations. 35 of those arrests were of African American, and I would bet my left pinky that the other 5 are Latinx folks and possibly Afro-Latinx folks, right? So it's really important that we understand that it has a disproportionate impact, not just on people of color, not just on poor people, but Black people in particular. In Los Angeles, Black community leaders, more than 50 of us, came together to do something unprecedented. Some of our groups never worked together. But we came together and we issued a set of 55 demands that focus on the immediate needs as well as the long-term needs to address this pandemic. And getting to this budget question, one of the big things that we lifted up is that we don't need police in our communities. One of the ways they can impact things like jobs is employ community workers. So this is a healthcare crisis with an economic fallout. So we don't need police responding to something that they don't have any expertise or business doing. Instead, why don't we employ unemployed people, have them go to the grocery stores and hand out masks and gloves, right? And we can really make an impact that's positive on communities. And then the last thing that I'll say is we see the way that this these misplaced priorities play out. Just this weekend in Jesse Owens Park, which is in South Central, frequented mostly by African Americans, we saw LAPD roll in under the guise of social distancing enforcement. They harassed a Black man who says he was just using the restroom. They interrogated him, they brutalized him, wound up arresting him along with 5 other people, and then pretended as if it had nothing to do with, again, the heightened police state under this pandemic. So what we need to do to keep our communities safe is pull those dollars back from police and invest them in things that actually make our communities safer.
Thank you, Melina. Before going to Pastor Q, where could folks find those lists of demands from all the organizations?
Oh, thank you for that. So they can go to tinyurl.com/Black LA demands, tinyurl.com/Black LA demands. And one of the beautiful things is after we engaged in our process, just a couple of days later, Black Oakland issued a set of similar demands. Black Sacramento issued a similar set of demands. Black San Diego is working on their demands. And we're also looking at convening as Black California to issue demands so that we make sure that we get our share of resources and attention to the Black community specifically.
Thank you. Pastor Q, in the midst of that, obviously I'd love to hear your thoughts on how COVID should be driving the budget conversation, but as spiritual beings that we are on this call, I think what Melina brought up that's critically important is in these times of massive, unprecedented pandemics or times of just loss or what have you, there's also the flip side where people are coming together like that letter and list of demands, right? Things that seemed not possible a few months ago are now definitely possible now, for example, right? Like, and I say this in the crux of someone that does not believe in the usefulness of prisons, for example, that our jail system, living in the largest jailer in the world, I've seen because of the work of organizers and those of you on this Zoom, from 17,000 down to almost 12,000 loved ones that are caged in our backyard, which again, 2 months ago, people would have thought we were crazy if we would have said that. So given that context of we are magicians creating the impossible, how and what should be driving this budget conversation?
Well, first of all, when we think about the budget, I usually use Skid Row as a microcosm, right, of the greater society. And one of the issues is that when COVID hit, we did not have an infrastructure that would save people, right? First of all, we didn't have an infrastructure for workers. 1.3 million people were at risk of being houseless, not just homeless, because Los Angeles is home to many people, right? But houseless. 1.3 million people were at risk. So think about how many people are now going to be houseless after COVID, right? The other thing that COVID exposed, now, first of all, we've been woke, right? We knew these things, but they finally got it. And it appears that they didn't get it, obviously, because the budget doesn't reflect that. The other thing is that we needed infrastructure for housing. If we had housing, if homeless people were housed, the Union Rescue Mission would not have 97 cases of people who were tested positive for COVID in missions where people are in close proximity. They couldn't practice social distancing. They put out some hand washing stations and bathrooms, by the way, that we've been asking for ever. They didn't even respond to the United Nations saying that Skid Row had less restroom access than a Syrian refugee camp. Not that any of that is okay, right? So all of these broken infrastructures, by the way, flawed infrastructures, because they're not broken, they were never meant to work well, right? They're flawed by design. So all of these infrastructures, when you think about Folks don't have a house to go to so that they can actually practice social distancing. If this was a greater, if this pandemic was more contagious, everybody in Skid Row would have died. Almost everybody would have died, because even when the governor said, okay, we have 15,000 hotel rooms, only 7,000 of those hotel rooms have been occupied, only 1,000 around here in Los Angeles. And so the entire infrastructure is in shambles because we're not putting in the resources in the very beginning, and we're always trying to respond to the crisis instead of making our city an oasis. We're always responding to crisis, and one of the ways we create those crises is by actually taking our budget and having a budget imbalance and putting all our money into policing, and therefore we don't have any resources for education or for anything else.
You know, this is really the issue, is how we use resources. And the use of resources is challenging when we're always in a resource challenged space. But given the lack of resources, they should be going to human needs, not to policing needs. And to increase the police budget while cutting the human needs budget is essentially to attack people. At the end of the day, it's to attack people.
Got it. Well, let me, before we jump into, I know we got some questions from those watching. I want to ask one more question that I think is, you know, Naomi Klein says we're in the midst of a battle of ideas, and in her seminal book, The Shock Doctrine, she says this is a time where ideas that were laying around are now all of a sudden becoming popularized on whatever side of aisles you sit on. But it seems like this budget is obviously fueled by fear, and an old, outdated, tough on crime playbook, if you will, and that myth that more incarceration and policing equals more public safety. Can you three share with us your thoughts on, you know, moving a budget based upon this myth? Why is this so dangerous? And what are the tangible results that we've seen? Melina, you kind of shared something that happened recently at the park, but, you know, can you deconstruct this myth of more policing and more caging makes us safer, and why this budget following that myth is dangerous?
Do you want me to go first?
Yeah, you can go first.
Okay. I think that it's really important that we think about where we want our resources to go. So we've seen Mayor Garcetti, who casts himself as a progressive, constantly increase the share of our taxpayer dollars of the general fund that goes to police. So at first we were outraged that he was spending 51% of the budget, then it went up to 52%, then 53%. Then at a time when there are cuts to every other department and program, when city employees are being furloughed, when departments are being cut by at least 10%, including 10% to salaries, when people are unhoused, when, you know, we need grid workers, interventionists more than ever, he's moving that amount up to 54%. And I think that, and this is my own analysis of it, that in our mayor, we have somebody who's extremely ambitious. He floated his own name as a presidential candidate a couple years ago, or about a year ago. And we know that he plans to, hopes to ascend to higher office. In that, what we're seeing with people who are so strongly pro-police, who will promote and advance and re-spend or spend more, double down on a police budget in the midst of a health care and economic crisis. What they really are doing is seeking to appease police associations, seeking to make sure that police continue to support them. And so that's what we're seeing, I think, with the mayor's budget proposal. I also want to uplift how undemocratic this process has been. This is the first time ever that the budgeting process did not go through the city council's budget committee. So normally people would have a chance to weigh in at multiple points of engagement. So at the committee level, then at the full city council level, they'd have a chance to lobby the mayor. And this time he sought to have the budget process fast-tracked. So we're looking at a city council who, if they listen to the call of the mayor, is scheduling themselves to vote on this very problematic budget as soon as possibly Thursday. And so this is why we came together so quickly and are saying we have to do something now. This is why we had the Twitter storm yesterday, which had People's Budget LA trending at #1, along with Care Not Cops at 2 and Block the LA Budget at 3. People do not want this kind of budget, but unfortunately, unless we make them listen, elected officials tend to listen to special interests above the people. So let's make our voices louder.
Well, let me ask before moving on to Dr. Malveaux and Pastor Q, though, Melina. This is kind of Akila's question as well. Like, is there rationale for why the process has been changed, or what's the rationale for increasing police budgets, specifically in light of cutting all these other critical services as well? Like, is there a rationale that's been given for those decisions?
So I think this is part of a larger effort to cast police as necessary for things that they are not necessary for. So public health pandemics don't require more police. Crime is down in Los Angeles by about 30%. So we should actually be cutting the budget. Even if you believe in police, which I don't, but even if you believe in police, as crime goes down, the need for police should drop. Instead, they are casting police as frontline workers for a health and economic crisis. So that's the rationale that they give. I also think that there's something that's happening in the era of social distancing, is that there's less of an opportunity for us to make our voices heard in the traditional sense. So I think both city council and the mayor think that they can get away with this with relatively little pushback. And so that's where it becomes incumbent upon us to say, no, we're here, we're watching, and there will be, because sometimes they only listen to political consequences, there will be political consequences if you ram this through.
Thank you. Dr. Malveaux, what are your observations, obviously, around this myth of public safety and these process questions that Dr. Abdullah just mentioned?
Well, I agree with everything that Melina has said, but let me go further that in the face of emergency, you begin to see predatory capitalism essentially assert itself. We can look back at, for example, Hurricane Katrina and what happened there in terms of over-policing, where the Black people who would get food were considered criminals, while the white people who went to get food were considered survivalists. So if you cannot gather to speak back to power, and that the social distancing basically makes it impossible to do, basically the voice of the people is not being heard. So it's really important for folks to understand the ways that emergencies are used to exploit. In other words, the ways that you can say, this is an emergency, this is a pandemic, blah, blah, blah. But these emergencies are being heard when a Black woman or brown woman goes to work at a hospital. She's being asked to go to work at a hospital. When that fool in the White House says that people have to process meat, don't need to be eating meat, pork anyway, another story. But when that's supposed to be some emergency, national emergency. But when our lives are in peril, this is not an emergency. When our bus drivers, Black and brown men, are in peril, this is not an emergency. And so we basically can see through this pandemic the extent to which basically predatory capitalism rules and people are sidelined. Now, more than that, as Melina has raised, the issue of people being able to gather and to speak truth to power in the face of this pandemic is powerful. So people cannot have rallies, but we can twitstorm. We can, forgive me, I'm old, so I said twitstorm. I think it means tweetstorm or something. But anyway, we can, we can make our voices heard. And then more importantly, blow their phones up. Blow their phones up, call them 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 times a day. We don't want this, because to take money from people's mouths, this is a time when city budgets should be used to support people, when our food banks should be supported by cities. Instead, you want to give more money to police and less money to people. That makes no sense, except for the fact that too many of us do not vote, that too many of us do not participate in the process. So this is a wake-up call for all of us, not only for local elections, but for November. Do you want to have this orange man, and I would be very polite there, this orange man to decide how money is spent, or do you want our tax dollars, let me underline that, our tax dollars to be spent on the people?
Thank you. Pastor Q, so, stories drive change oftentimes more than facts. And in LA last year, there was a striking at least 16% increase in the unhoused population in Los Angeles. Yet our budget doesn't account for this increase. So this idea that more police makes us safer, how have you seen that play out on Skid Row?
Well, first of all, when you talk about more police, we've got to understand why the mayor feels like we need more police, right? We've got NIMBYism, right? If you go to South Park, which is by the Staples Center, it's not that we don't have housing. We don't have housing for poor folks, right? Because you got housing like the Genesis and the Grace buildings in South Park that are 85 to 75% vacant. These are lofts. So we have housing. We just don't have housing for poor people. We don't have housing for the so-called essential workers. Workers we knew that was essential 7 years ago when we were fighting for $15 an hour for these workers here in Los Angeles. Now all of a sudden they become essential because they get to bring the groceries home to certain people. So we can't undermine how racism plays into this, right? It's huge because there are people that the mayor is answering to and city officials are answering to the police union, they're answering to developers, and they're also answering to the NIMBYs who are saying, hey, we don't, that's one of the reasons we can't fill the hotel rooms, because NIMBYs are saying not in my backyard. So all of this is rooted in the same racism that got us here, is the same racism that keeps us here. And so when you think about the budget reflects violence, because policing and militarism is all about violence. So we got this nation through violence. So what do you think, how do you think we're going to keep the nation? We're going to keep it through violence unless the people rise up and say, hey, we don't want the system anymore. And the truth is, many of us are too invested in the system to get rid of it.
Mm-hmm.
With that last kind of piece, and this is a question for any of the speakers and panelists, has there been any info on police associations or other vested interests in this particular budget? Like obviously, follow the money. We've been talking about capitalism and other things, but who benefits beyond obviously who's driving this outside of those policymakers?
Well, the law and order crowd has always benefited from the overinvestment in the police state. It allows them to maintain their racism We see what happened to the young brother in Georgia. It allows them to say, Black folks are dangerous and white folks are defending. So if you do anything that seems to basically violate their sixth sense of superiority, it allows them to essentially shoot first and ask questions later. And we can go back to Reconstruction. We can go back so many places in our history where Black people in particular have been thingified. So that when you're thingified, it means that you basically are seen as less than. And when you over-invest in a police state, you basically under-invest in Black and brown humanity. And from that perspective, when you put all this money into police, when you allow white folks to run around with guns shooting people because they just scared. Well, you know, if you're scared, stay in your house. But essentially, it allows folks to be empowered. And when you overinvest in the police state, it further allows that empowerment. This is Trayvon, but we can call the roll. We don't have to call the roll. Trayvon Martin, Philando Castile, call the roll. But what we're basically saying is that in times of oppression, in times of emergency, it's easy to pick off an enemy. I find it reprehensible totally that with cuts in the human services budget, the police budget would be increased, because that really feeds into the trope that there's a public safety emergency, but not a public health emergency. So those are the gainers.
Great. Pastor Q or Melina, would you like to share anything on that question about who's benefiting? I mean, obviously we were talking about who's not, but.
Go ahead, Melina.
Well, absolutely, the police state is benefiting. Individual officers are benefiting. White supremacy is benefiting. Rampant capitalism is benefiting. When you deny a community resources and spend on police in a time when we don't need them, right? When crime is dropping, you're basically using police to shore up the existing system. And so they get some of the benefit themselves, police get some of the benefit themselves, but also capitalism overall gets the benefit. White supremacy overall gets the benefit.
Pastor Q?
Yeah, and they also get the benefits of keeping the narrative going, right? That Black people, it's personal responsibility. That's why Black people are dying at an unprecedented rate as it relates to COVID-19. They don't show you the years of abuse, right, that Black folks have had to deal with, the stresses that would cause, high blood pressure and food deserts and the ghetto conditions, right? But it helps them to keep that narrative going. I know a gentleman in Skid Row who was arrested 13 times in 1 year, right, for minor offenses. Think about how much money that is, how much resources and what that could have done for our society and for that young man himself.
So just in terms of the framework, I think, and why this town hall was put together, we now have historical data and research that overspending on cages and policing makes us less safe, because a larger budget that prioritizes policing means less investment in community-based drug and mental health treatment, education, and other services and institutions that can make us safer. There's also been, like we've been saying, the data, and we have an economist and doctors on this town hall that, over policing and targeting a specific Black, brown, indigenous, poor communities in particular breeds distrust of police, making us less likely to report crimes and, continuing this history of criminalization and over-policing. With that being said, in the last kind of 15 minutes here, I wanted to ask all the panelists, like, what are exact concrete steps that people could take to ensure that the process is more democratic, to ensure that people's voices are heard, to ensure that, we don't go backwards. And, I mentioned the incredible organizing happening to reduce our jail population. And, it showed that we should have never been caging our loved ones in the first place, obviously. But my biggest fear has always been is like, we're doing things because of COVID, but the question is, how do we make them permanent? And I know from being involved in budget deliberations that the hardest thing to do is to actually increase a budget, because once it's increased, it's hard to cut, And so what are ways that folks can make their voices heard in the time of COVID? We've heard like calling and faxing and, pressuring them. But what are some concrete ways that folks that are listening to this and that will listen to this, what are ways that we can make our voices heard and make sure that the budget process is shifted?
Well, I think that Melina Abdullah should run for public office. I think that my sister we need more people who are progressive and who basically get it to be in public spaces. Everybody brown ain't down. So all too often we see a Black or brown person running for office, but they buy into the system. We need people who are basically, excuse my language, shit disturbers to essentially run for public office. We need people to say, this is not happening. And I would say that those who, maybe she doesn't want to run, maybe she has too much going on, but we need to find people like her to basically storm the system. We need to have folks who will raise their voices and say, this is not happening. Secondly, of course, is the calling and the writing and all of that needs to occur. And when the pandemic is over, we need to essentially show up in these people's offices. I was really disappointed, and Dr. Abdullah helped me out because I thought that Garcetti was something of a progressive. That's how he shows up nationally. But this move is not a progressive move. And so again, as I said, everybody progressive ain't progressive. And we need to really begin to call some of these people out, especially when they are so clear that we mean so little to them. But the bottom line is our own activism. How did the Orange Man get elected? A whole lot of people voted for him. They thought he was going to bring law and order. Well, now you know what you got. But we need to basically, but Joe Biden ain't all that, but he's a whole lot better than the Orange Man. We need to be mobilized to ensure that we don't have this stuff going on. This man does not even want to be, he's fired 4 general inspectors in a month. He does not want to be scrutinized. We can't have that, but we can have it if we choose not to vote, if we choose not to call, if we choose not to write, if we decide, well, this is just how it is. No, this is not how it is. I forgive my passion, but this gets on my GD nerves.
We need that. Dr. Abdullah?
Sure. So I am so honored that you would say that, Dr. Malveaux. I've been a fan of yours since the 90s, and you are absolutely one of the people who inspired me to go on to graduate school. And I'm so excited that you're part of this conversation. You've just been one who, when many people kind of hide behind their degrees and use them to kind of exalt themselves, you've always been so clear that your degree is for the liberation of our people. And so I'm just so thankful that you're here, and I'm honored by your vote of confidence. I wouldn't run for office. I won't ever say never, but 99.9% no. But I agree completely that we need really strong folks in office. We need folks in office who are unafraid and, in the words of Shirley Chisholm, unbought and unbossed. Mm-hmm. And so we absolutely have to recruit them to run. I've been in conversations with some folks who we need to pull in, and I think that that's really important. I also think that we have power right now to disrupt this process right now. And so when we finish with this town hall, we want everybody to make 3 calls. We want you to call Mayor Garcetti at 213-978-0600, 213-978-0600. That number is in the chat, but you may be watching on Facebook, so I don't know if it's there. 213-978-0600. We want you to call City Council member Nuri Martinez. Her number is 213-473-7006, 213-473-7006. And then we want you to look up who your own council member is. Hopefully you know already, and call them and tell all 3 of them that we want to fund services, not police. Fund services, not police, and to reject this budget. Here's something else you can do. It's been agendized that they will be taking public comment on this budget tomorrow. And so at 10 a.m. tomorrow, we can join the city council meeting virtually, and we'll put the link up. The link is already up on our website, peoplesbudgetla.com, peoplesbudgetla.com. And we want you to weigh in and say what you think about this budget. And then finally, we're pushing, well, not finally, second to finally, we are pushing for a delayed process. We know that our partners in labor haven't even gotten a chance to negotiate with the city council. Remember, they didn't have a budget committee hearing. And so by statute, this budget doesn't have to go back to the mayor until June 1st. There's no reason that they should be taking a budget vote this week. We want them to delay the process at least until June 1st, at least next week, but take the vote on June 1st and then send it back to the mayor. And then we keep pressuring the mayor then. Finally, we want to say that, or I want to say that Dr. Malveaux is right. We all have to vote. And I believe in voting plus, right? So we got to vote out elected officials who are in the pockets of police associations. People, we're not talking about her right now, but people like District Attorney Jackie Lacey, who is literally bought by these police associations. We have to vote her out of office. I love that saying, all brown ain't down. We also use Zora Neale Hurston, all skin folk ain't kinfolk, right? And so we need to make sure that we vote these folks out of office, but remember that our responsibility extends far beyond the voting booth. We need to vote plus. In the words of Kwame Ture, we have to organize, organize, organize. And so join us at peoplesbudgetla.com. Join Black Lives Matter Los Angeles at blmla.org. Follow the work of Church Without Walls, of Los Angeles Community Action Network, of Stop LAPD Spying Coalition, Ground Game, all of the organizations that help to bring this to you. Please follow our work and get involved in any way you can, because only the people, so they talk about power and people always beat out money. People will beat police. People will beat this oppressive regime if we all engage.
Thank you, Melina. Pastor Q, I had a whole question, but Melina just knocked it out of the park with part of my question there. But I wanted to ask you, just in the last kind of 5 minutes that we have, you know, we know the numbers we got to call. We know the important meeting that we have to attend tomorrow. You know, this is one of many fights that are interrelated. After this budget process, what can people do to continue to hold things accountable, but also to build the kind of world we know is possible?
Well, first of all, we've been talking about the public policy end, and that definitely needs to happen. But we've also got to build, right? We just had a conversation. Dr. Melina and I were on a call, and we had a conversation about Black autonomy, right? We talked about how do we, like at LA Can, we've got a rooftop garden. We've got to continue to build the community, the type of community we want to see. We can't just sit back and wait for them to do for us. No, we've got to build our own power. And while we're building our own power, build our own health, build our own community, build our own economy. And so that takes a lot of work. So we have to organize to do that, join an organization like LA Can or BLM or another organization that is doing work on the ground. And not only are we fighting and we are using public and we're fighting public policy, but we're also building our own community, because that's the only way we're going to do it. We can't wait on a president to do something for us. We can't wait on, we saw that, you know, even if you have a black president, all a black president does is manages a white system, right? So we need to build our own. We need to continue to build like we've been doing, and that way we can respond. Because had we not had an organization like LA Can, when the city put out all these hand washing stations and they went empty in like 24 hours, there was no more water in them so people can wash their hands and clean their hands and decrease the chances of catching COVID, or there was no soap in them or anything like that. We took our own resources and we started building hand washing stations and making sure that our folks was clean, right? We've got to take control of our entire community. And by the way, if you want to make an old model obsolete, what you have to do is build a new model that makes the old model obsolete. So if we want to get police out of our community, we need to build our own power. We need to build our own communities. We need to show them that they're not needed, and we can do that.
Great. So I want to just give you guys one last closing comments. There's been a couple questions, and maybe if you guys can address them in there. One question was around speaking to the point about the ways that the care packages and the stimulus checks are ways to silence folks from demanding a radical transformation of a budget like the one that's being proposed here in LA. And then the other one is a question where folks just wanted to know, they understand the context of why LAPD should be getting less funding, but has the percentage going to LAPD increased in this new budget? And if so, what percentage went to LAPD in non-pandemic times? And so in terms of closing statements, just to address, those are the two last questions from the audience. But closing statements, I'll start with you, Dr. Malveaux, then Pastor Q, and we'll end with the mighty Melina.
The mighty Melina, that's wonderful. I don't have the details of the LA budget, but I do know that when you increase some budgets and decrease others, a budget is a statement of your priorities. A budget tells you what's important. Even in your own personal finance budget, it tells you what you prioritize. And so to increase police and decrease other things says that so-called law and order is more important than basically human needs, and we have to deal with it there. What I would just say in closing, I want to thank Dr. Melina for including me in this. I don't live in LA. I'm a native San Franciscan, so I've not even spent that much time in LA. But I know that LA is one of our largest cities, and it reflects the priorities of our nation. And from that particular vantage point, what we need to understand is that Mayor Garcetti has garnered enormous national public prominence for his situations and his stands. And that is something that the people of LA can put a stop to. I think that it's absurd. It's utterly absurd. When Melina asked me to join the group, I went online and looked at some of the things that are being done. And what we're doing essentially is starving the people, again, starving the people in the interest of so-called law and order, when, as Melina has said, crime is down. Nobody's outside, so who's committing crimes? Crime is down, but it also raises questions about crime. It raises questions about how we deal with disorder in the face of a pandemic. People need food. People need housing. People need education, and these things aren't happening. And it requires a committed, activist group of people to basically hold this nonsense up and say enough, enough, enough.
Thank you. Pastor Q, final comments?
Well, in this time, if you're going to make a sacrifice as it relates to the budget, And if you're giving LAPD more money, more resources, then what you're doing is you're making a sacrifice, because somebody's not going to get something. And if you're going to make a sacrifice, then you need to make that sacrifice in housing. You need to make that sacrifice in housing our people. You need to make that sacrifice in shoring up the income and the economy of working class people, the 1.3 million people who were living just one paycheck away, just at risk of being being houseless. That 1.3 million people. If you're going to make a sacrifice, sacrifice it there. Don't tell me that our people are essential workers and the way you reward them is to give police more money. You're not giving them more money. You want to give them a clap. You want to make noise from a building. You want to give them words. Yeah, words are fine. But at the same time, we need you to put your money where your mouth is. And obviously, you know, the people that you're more concerned about is the police union. You're not concerned about the people who are working in the grocery store. You're not concerned about the people who are dying as nurses who are taking care of our folks who are dying. You're not concerned about those people. You're not concerned about the houseless people whom, by the way, you left them to die on Skid Row. It's only by the grace of God that people are still living on the streets, because they're still on the streets because you were supposed to have hotel rooms for them, but you moved so slow that by the time the hotel room came, we were 2 months into the pandemic, which means you were hoping that they would die. If you're going to give somebody a budget, give it to those people.
Thank you. Melina?
Yeah, absolutely. I want to echo everything that Dr. Malveaux and Pastor Q both said, especially around the budget is a statement of our priorities and our ethics, right? And so if we're overspending on police, that's clearly taking a immoral positioning. This is an immoral budget. It's important that we lift that up. It's also important that we understand that this is not just a question of opinion. Every research study shows, and you can go to University of Michigan's research, Stanford's research, UCLA's research. Please read City of Inmates by Kelly Lytle Hernandez, which is one of the most important books on this idea of over-policing and over-incarceration in Los Angeles in particular. All of these studies, go to $1 Million Hoods research, right, out of UCLA, show that it's prevention and intervention work, it's housing, it's good jobs, good livable wage jobs, it's mental health resources that create safe communities. They're overspending on police not because we need them, but because they have an immoral positioning that puts their ambition that they see as tied to this expanding police state. They put that ahead of the good of the people, right? So we want to do good for our people. And so that means changing the way that budgeting works. And I want to uplift just in this last few moments that we can do this. We see this happening in places like Newark, New Jersey, where Mayor Raz Baraka is spending money to create community care teams, where folks who are indigenous to their communities are the ones responsible for creating safety plans and responding to crises in communities. And people, because they respect and trust these folks, are listening to them, right? And our brother here from Los Angeles, Aquila Shirills, is instrumental in developing that process. We know that in Jackson, Mississippi, Mayor Chokwe Lumumba is implementing similar plans where he's saying that we don't need to incarcerate and criminalize people. Instead, we need to provide resources for our people. And so we're saying that let's make that go national. The rhetoric around decarceration has echoed. We need to make the rhetoric around depolicing, defunding police, and investing, divesting from police and investing in the things that actually make communities safe. We need that to echo. There was a last question about the police budget. LAPD budget has gone up about $100 million every year. This year it's going up $200 million. And so it's important that we understand, just like we saw the explosion of mass incarceration, we're seeing the explosion of over-policing. And so we have to push back just as hard, because they're 2 points on the same continuum.
Great. Well, I want to thank you all. If we were in person, we would do one of those claps. Dr. Melina Abdullah, Dr. Julianne Malveaux, and Pastor Q, thank you for your life's work, and thank you for the ancestors that brought you to us. I also want to thank the sponsors of the Town Hall, Black Lives Matter Los Angeles, People's City Council Los Angeles, White People for Black Lives, K-Town for All, Ground Game LA, La Defensa, Stop LAPD Spying, Students Deserve, and Africa Town Coalition, as well as big ups to the Justice Collaborative for helping on the back end. And the last thing I'll just say is, for more information, please go to peoplesbudgetla.com. Once again, it's peoplesbudgetla.com for concrete ways that you can continue to have your voice and your lives matter. So thank you so much for your guys' time.
Mike, thank you, everybody.
One
Thank
love,
you for
power to the people.
expert moderation. Appreciate you, Dr.
Yes.
Q, and of course, Dr. Melina.
Thank you,
Appreciate you as well.
All right,
Thank
you all.
you.
Have a beautiful day.